Today's video is not just for people who have FrSky R9 hardware and who are kind of looking to get out of it. If you've got FrSky R9 hardware and you're sick of FrSky's weirdo firmware ecosystem, what will bind to what? EU, Flex, R9, Access, If that's how you feel about your FrSky hardware, then you are definitely going to want to watch today's video, but not just you. Because today we're talking about ExpressLRS. ExpressLRS is one of the highest performance, longest range, lowest latency control links you can run. Compared to Crossfire, compared to Tracer, compared to Ghost, there are reasons why you might choose ExpressLRS instead. And that's especially interesting because ExpressLRS is completely open source and completely free. You could just get a piece of hardware like this R9 module. This is good hardware. FrSky makes good modules and good receivers. They just make weird firmware that's all incompatible, and it's frustrating to figure out how to bind. So no matter why you're interested in ExpressLRS, today we are going to flash ExpressLRS to this module and to a receiver. We're going to show you how to get into ExpressLRS. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. Before we get into this video, I want to just take a minute and clarify what ExpressLRS is. I talked a little bit in the intro that it is a control link firmware, similar to Crossfire, Tracer, or Ghost. And when you think about those technologies, there's hardware, there's the actual physical module, the radio, and there's the software. And ExpressLRS is the software. It runs on a lot of different pieces of hardware. In fact, we're going to be putting it on this 900 megahertz FrSky R9 module. There's also a 2.4 gigahertz version of ExpressLRS, similar to Tracer or Ghost, if you don't like the 900 megahertz frequency band for some reason. But we're going to be working here on this because I think number one, one of the easiest ways to get into ExpressLRS is to put it on FrSky R9 hardware. And number two, I think there's probably a whole lot of people with FrSky R9 hardware who would like to try something, if not better, then maybe different. And the great thing about ExpressLRS is that as of today, it's not a permanent decision. You can flash ExpressLRS on this module. And you don't like it, you can flash it back to R9. It's no big deal. So you could try it out and there's no sort of commitment. And the module that I'm going to be using is the FrSky Access R9 2019 OTA module. If you have one of the older, the 2018 FrSky R9 modules with the ACCST protocol, they can also be used, but there is a resistor mod that needs to be done. UAV Tech has a video about how to do the resistor mod. I'll put a link to that in the video description. The thing is, there's lots of different hardware you could put this on, and there's too many varieties for me to cover them all in this one video. So we're just going to do this hardware, and you'll get the idea. And then you can check the ExpressLRS wiki for other tutorials that pertain to your hardware if you're working with other hardware. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the ExpressLRS wiki, link in the video description, of course. And we're going to go down to the software installation / quick start section, and we're going to download and install the ExpressLRS Configurator. This used to be way more complicated than it is today. You had to install a whole bunch of programming and compiling tools. Today, you don't have to do any of that. Just download the ExpressLRS Configurator for your platform. In my case, it's Windows, so I'm going to be downloading ExpressLRS Configurator Setup 0411.exe. It installs just like any other Windows app or Mac OS or Red Hat, Fedora, whatever, Linux, you name it. The next thing we got to do is download and flash a custom version of OpenTX to our radio. And we can get that by going here and then go to this link. And again, that link will be in the video description, as well as you can just find it through the wiki. We're going to download the bin file that corresponds to the radio that we have. My radio is a Radiomaster TX16S. So that's going to be OpenTX TX16S 2310.bin. By the way, if you're running a custom version of OpenTX right now because you have ImmersionRC Ghost support, or because you are using the Crossfire Shot function, The ExpressLRS firmwares have both of those things built in, so you're getting the best of both worlds. If you're running a custom version of OpenTX for some other reason, though, you may lose that functionality by flashing this. GitHub has a little bit of a weird way of downloading files. I'm going to click this file. It's going to take me to this screen, and then I'm not going to click the download button. I'm going to right-click and save link as the download button. I'm going to put that in my downloads folder and save. The next thing I'm going to do is I got to put that file on my radio's SD card. I could take the SD card out of the radio and just plug it into a card reader, or I can turn the radio on. I can plug USB into the radio. The radio will ask whether I want USB joystick or USB storage. I'm going to pick USB storage. At that point, 2 removable drives will pop up on the computer. One of them will contain this firmware.bin and firmware.txt file. That is your radio's operating system. Do not mess with that. Just close that window. The next one will be your SD card contents. And what we're going to want to do is go into the firmware folder. And I've actually made a folder here, ExpressLRS ELRS. And we'll go into there, and we're going to take and we're going to copy that file from the downloads folder over to the SD card. Hey there, folks. Joshua from the future here. Before you proceed, Joshua got one thing wrong, and as usual, I'm here to set it straight. In your firmware folder, in your ExpressLRS folder, Joshua's putting all his ExpressLRS firmwares in here, and that's cool, but this OpenTX firmware actually has to be in the firmware folder, not any subfolder. So I'm just going to right-click, copy that. I'm going to go back to my firmware folder and right-click, paste, and then we'll be good to go. In addition to that, we're going to want to get this file, R9M ELRS _BL.frk, and we're going to want to put that onto the SD card in the firmware folder. And we're going to need to compile a version of ExpressLRS for our receiver, and we're going to do that using the ExpressLRS Configurator. Let's do that now. This is ExpressLRS Configurator. It is an app that is used to compile the firmware that you're going to flash onto your ExpressLRS receiver. Normally, the manufacturer or the programmer compiles firmware for you, but ExpressLRS goes on a bunch of different hardware and is constantly being updated, so they leave it to you to compile it yourself. The good news is that don't be scared by the fact that I'm saying the word compile, and that sounds like a big complicated thing to do. It used to be somewhat difficult if you weren't a programmer, but today the ExpressLRS Configurator basically does it all for you. It's pretty automatic. Here's how to do it. First, we're going to select the firmware version that we're working with. We'll stay under official releases, and we'll just choose the latest one. At this time, it's 013RC2. The next thing that I'm going to want to do is pick the target, and that relates to the hardware that I'm going to put this firmware on. And the target that I'm going to build for right now is FrSky TX. So this is the module firmware. We're going to build the receiver firmware a little later in the video. And this is the R9M via stock bootloader, not the R9M Lite, FrSky TX R9M via stock bootloader. That's what I'm going to want to pick. Now there are a few other options here that you can set, and most of these we're just going to leave on our defaults, at least for the first time we're flashing it. But one of them that you're going to need to set is the regulatory domain. And the regulatory domain depends on where in the world you are. Much of the world is 915 megahertz ISM, and that is either regions 2 or regions 3. If you're in this yellow region, you're going to choose 868 EU, even though quite a lot of this is not the EU. And if you're in Australia, we have a special region for you blokes. It's the 915 AU region. Apologies, Australians. So we're going to set the regulatory domain, and the other thing we can do is we can set the binding phrase. This is a really cool thing that ExpressLRS, one of the coolest things they've done in my opinion. If you put a binding phrase here, then any module and any receiver that you flash with this firmware will be pre-bound. You don't have to hit the binding button. Just the minute it's like your Wi-Fi password. Just the minute you flash it, it's just ready to go and it's bound. I'm going to have my editor mosaic out this binding phrase so you guys don't know what binding phrase I'm using. And You couldn't like, I don't know what you would do with that information anyway. So the next thing we're going to do then is hit build, and it is going to compile that firmware. And I want to let you know that the first time you do this, it has to download a whole bunch of stuff, and it takes like 10 minutes. I'm not joking. And halfway through, you're going to think it's failed and it's locked up, and you're going to think about maybe rebooting your computer. Just go get a cup of coffee, get a cup of tea, get a soda, whatever you like. Come back in a few minutes and you'll be ready to go. Mine just literally, that's how fast it went, because it's not the first time I've done this. Subsequent times will go faster. After it finishes building, it'll show success right here, and it will pop up this Explorer window highlighting the firmware.elrs file. You're going to want to take that, and you are going to copy that also to your firmware folder on your SD card, or in my case, I've got the ExpressLRS subfolder, firmware.elrs. And if you really feel like it, maybe you could even rename that. This is FrSky TX R9M via stock BL, but firmware.elrs is just going to be fine for me. The last thing we're going to put on our SD card before we proceed is we're going to go to this page, Flashing with TX, and we're going to need to download this file, R9mm ELRSBL.FRK, and we're going to also copy that to the firmware folder. And notice that we've already got this one, R9M ELRSBL.FRK. That's for the module. R9mm is for the receiver. Once you've got these files on your SD card, you're ready to proceed. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to flash our radio. And I strongly recommend that before you do this, you back up your radio using OpenTX Companion. Every time you flash your radio, there's a chance that something will go wrong. And anytime something goes wrong, your radio goes, ah, and it wipes itself completely back to defaults, and you lose all your models. So don't let that happen. Let's open up OpenTX Companion. I've got another video about how to install OpenTX Companion. I'll put that down in the video description if you don't know how to do that. We'll do read-write, read models and settings from radio. Once that's done, we'll do File, Save As. And I've got that saved here, and we'll just save that, and done. Now that that's done, we can proceed. Next thing I'm going to do is power down my radio and unplug USB. And then I'm going to put my radio into bootloader mode. And on almost all FrSky radios, the way you do that is you press in on the trim switches while you power up the radio. And you'll see this screen. And we'll do write firmware, and we'll see that ExpressLRS OpenTX firmware, and we'll click, and then it'll hold enter, hold long press enter to flash, or the jog wheel on the Radio Master. You'll long press that and it'll flash it. I'm not going to do that because the last time I did that, it wiped my config. Probably won't do that again, but I've already done this once and I'm not going through it twice. More power to you. By the way, if for some reason it does freak out and wipe out your radio, the way to get it back is to go into Companion, do File Open, open up that OTX file that you saved, plug in your radio, mass storage, just like we did, and just do Write Models and Settings to Radio. It'll put your radio right back how it was. So when you power up your radio after flashing OpenTX, you may get an SD card warning. And that SD card warning is going to say expected version 2.3. It's going to have some number there. So we're going to need to go download the correct SD card contents from the OpenTX website. The version that my radio wants is version 0030. Let's see, where this is 2.3.10 is the version of OpenTX. 2.3.10. So we're going to go to the OpenTX website. We're going to go to the 2.3.10 page, and we're going to scroll down to the SD card content for 2.3.10. We're going to go into our radios subfolder. This is the TX16S, and we're going to look for firmware 0030, which for some confusing reason isn't there. So I guess what I'm going to do is I'm going to download 0029, which is the closest. This is because this is a custom build of OpenTX that was never actually released. I guess I'm just going to pick the closest firmware, or the closest version to what it actually asked for. If you see the version that it actually asked for, then use that. But I'm going to download that zip file. Here in your downloads folder, you're going to have this SD card zip file. I'm going to open that up, And we'll see here the new SD card contents. And here is the SD card via the USB plug into my radio. And what I'm going to do is I am going to delete all of that except for, I'm going to control click to deselect the firmware folder. I don't want to delete my firmware folder. I've got stuff in there that I want to keep. If you have custom images, model images, if you have custom sounds, you can delete those. You can deselect those. We're going to delete all of that, and then we're going to take this and copy it over and overwrite the current contents of the SD card. By the way, this will take for freaking ever if you do it via the USB plug. I would strongly recommend taking your SD card out of your radio and use an SD card reader. It'll be way, way faster. Now, unfortunately, my radio wants SD card contents version 0030, but that wasn't on the OpenTX website, and we had to just download the next best thing. If you're in that same situation, here's how to get rid of the warning. You just open up this file, opentx.sdcard.version, and we're just going to edit that. You can edit it with Notepad. You can edit it with, I'm using Notepad++, whatever. Just use a text editor, and we're just going to take the contents. See, it says 2.3v0029. I'm just going to change that to 0030 and save the file. People do this. You should always have the correct SD card contents if possible. People do this to get rid of the warning message when they really need to update their SD card contents. We're only doing this because the actual version that we need wasn't even available. Okay, continuing on. Okay, the next thing to do is to actually put the firmware onto the module. And we can unplug the USB for this part. We're going to plug the module in to the back of the radio. And you're probably going to want to make a new model for ExpressLRS. You see I've created a new model here. So I'm going to select that model. And here in the model setup menu, we're going to have as our external RF, we're going to set that to Crossfire. And I'm sure you're wondering why we've set that to Crossfire, because we're using ExpressLRS. But ExpressLRS actually just uses the Crossfire protocol to talk to the module. So we set it to Crossfire. And once you do that, you should see that the module is powered up. By the way, make sure you've got your antenna installed. Otherwise, you'll burn out your module. I'm now going to back out. I'm going to long press the Sys key to go to the Tools menu. And I'm going to page to the SD card. I'm going to go down to the firmware folder. I'm going to go into the ExpressLRS folder, and I'm going to choose the R9M ELRS BL FRK file. Make sure you choose the R9M file, not the R9MM file. I'm going to long press and flash external module. Then I'm going to choose the firmware.elrs file. I'm going to long press, and you should see now flash ext ELRS. If you do not see flash ext ELRS, that means the module doesn't have the ExpressLRS bootloader on it, which is what we just did. And that's why you wouldn't see that. So you should see flash ext ELRS, and we'll let that proceed. And that is the ExpressLRS startup tone, which is your confirmation that ExpressLRS is now on your module. Now, I told you earlier in this video that this was a totally reversible situation. None of this is permanent. If you feel like you want to go back to FrSky R9, you'll see that here in my SD card contents, I've got the firmware folder and I've got the ExpressLRS folder, but I also made an R9 folder. And that R9 folder has my FrSky R9 firmware in there. And I can easily just reflash that firmware and be good to go. Now that we've got ExpressLRS onto the module, the next thing that I want you to do is download the ExpressLRS Lua script, which is going to let us configure some parameters of the module. We can get that from this link in the video description, of course. We're going to go here. We're going to download this file. And once again, downloading from GitHub is a little bit annoying. What if I say go to file? No. What if I right click on raw and I save link as? Yes. That's going to download the ELRS.Lua. And once again, we're going to go to our SD card by plugging in USB to the radio. And I think we're going to put that in scripts. Tools? How about tools? Let's try that. Copy that. Let's put that in scripts/tools. We'll paste that in there. We'll go ahead and unplug USB. And now, if I long press the sys key, oh, bingo, ExpressLRS is right there. And if I run that, yay, it's talking to the module, and that's good. The next thing we're going to do is flash the firmware to the receiver. And there's two ways to go about this. The first way, we're going to use the radio, and we're going to put the firmware on the SD card, and we're going to flash the receiver using the radio. And then once it's installed in the quadcopter, there's going to be another way that we do it, because you're not going to want to take it out of the quadcopter and attach it to the radio in order to flash it. If you're familiar with Crossfire, Tracer, Ghost, and FrSky Access, which support over-the-air firmware updates where you can wirelessly update the firmware on your receiver, ExpressLRS doesn't support that. But there's another workaround that is nearly as convenient. Not quite. The first flash, though, we're going to do using the radio. And in order to do that, we're going to need a cable. Now this cable right here, this comes with a FrSky RxSR, and it is the flashing cable for an RxSR. It has a servo plug on one side and an RxSR plug on the other. I don't remember, but I don't think the R9mm comes with this cable. So you're going to need to source, well, either a servo plug or some other way to make this electrical connection. You might have to actually just go buy a servo harness from, a hobby store. What a concept. Now, a lot of FrSky radios have a programming plug or a flashing plug on the bottom of the radio. So if we look right here on the bottom of this X9 Lite, we can see a servo plug right there, and that is where we are going to plug the receiver in order to flash it. On the bottom of my Radio Master, there are servo plugs, but unfortunately, the Radio Master does not support flashing via those plugs. If we have a Radio Master, a jumper, or some other third-party radio that doesn't support that, we are going to flash using the JR module bay on the back. So we'll have to take the R9 module out of the back, and I'll show you how to wire it up to these pins in the back of the module bay. Here's my R9mm receiver, and I'm going to wire this receiver up the same way that you see here on this diagram from the ExpressLRS wiki. And I'm going to do that rather than soldering. I'm going to use these little spring-loaded clippy clips, and I'm going to see how that works for me. And here I've got it clipped up, but pay close attention to the diagram. I have the receiver upside down, and I have clipped it the wrong way around, and that would be probably bad. So don't do that. Make sure you get it the right way around. This is with the antenna on bottom. All right, there we go. We've wired it up as described. Now, if you're using a FrSky radio with a programming plug on the bottom, you're going to wire up that servo plug in the standard order, the exact way that the wires came in the servo plug: yellow for signal, red for power, and black for ground. But the module bay in the back of a radio has a slightly different pinout, and we're going to need to change that around. And whenever I need to remind myself the order of the wires, I go back to this page on Oscar Leong's website, and I can see that it's going to be the bottom 3 pins, and it goes power, ground, signal. So I'm going to plug in here to the bottom 3 pins, and I'm going to have the yellow signal wire on bottom, but then I'm going to reverse the red and the black wires, because that's how the pinout of this radio, of all JR module bays, works. Now be really careful that you've got this wiring correct. In fact, you might even try testing with a multimeter to make 100% sure that everything is correct before you connect up your receiver. If you get power and ground backwards, you can completely fry your receiver. That's not on me if you do that. The other warning is that if you are for some reason powering your radio from a 3S battery, it will fry the receiver. The receiver is only good up to about, I think, 10 volts. So you need to be powering your receiver from a 2S battery, which is what the factory usually ships it as. But sometimes people have an aftermarket battery. And with that done, we're going to power up our radio, and we should see that the receiver is powered up as well. Next, I'm going to hold down the sys key, and I'm going to page over to my SD card. I'm going to go down to the firmware folder. I'm going to go into my ExpressLRS folder, and I'm going to flash the R9mm bootloader FRK file. Notice the R9mm, not the R9M. And I'm going to choose here flash external module because that's the only thing my TX16 supports. But if you're using a FrSky radio and you've plugged into the plug on the bottom of the radio, then you're going to go into your firmware folder, and you're going to choose flash S port. Flash S port means flash the plug on the bottom of the radio. Flash external means flash the plug on the back of the radio. Now that the bootloader is on the receiver, we could go ahead and flash the receiver by putting a firmware file on the SD card. But as I mentioned earlier, most of the time that's not how you're going to do it because you're not going to want to take your receiver out of your quadcopter. So now let's wire up the receiver to a flight controller. We'll learn how to set that up, and then we'll see how to flash the receiver using Betaflight serial pass-through, which is the method the ExpressLRS devs usually recommend. Next, I've gone over to the bench and I have connected up the receiver to my very own JBF7 flight controller according to this diagram. The diagram doesn't show the 5 volt and the ground wires. They're going to go ground and 5 volts. And they're going to go to any 5 volt and ground pad on the flight controller, like any other receiver. The other thing to keep in mind is that you are not using the smart port or S-bus or any of those normal pads here at the end of the receiver. You're using these two pads. RX1 here is going to go to TX on the flight controller. TX1 is going to go to RX on the flight controller, and they're going to go to any UART, TX, and RX pads. There's no inversion, none of that nonsense that you usually have to deal with FrSky, whether you've got an F4 flight controller or an F7. Just find yourself two unused UART, TX, and RX pads and solder it up as shown here. Then we are going to plug in our flight controller, and we're going to bring up Betaflight Configurator. Connect. And we're going to go to the ports tab. And I have got UART 1 soldered to my receiver. So we're going to make sure that serial RX is enabled on UART 1 or whatever UART you soldered to, obviously. And it is by default on my flight controller. But you can go ahead and enable that and save and reboot if you need to. And we're going to go to the configuration tab. And we're going to set the serial receiver protocol to Crossfire, which is, it uses Crossfire on the wire to talk to the flight controller, but it uses ExpressLRS in the air. Anyway, we'll save and reboot. Now we're going to flash the firmware to the receiver. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to close Betaflight Configurator. We don't want it running in the background, potentially grabbing the serial port and getting in the way of things. We're going to plug in the flight controller, and you'll notice on my flight controller, that the receiver is powered up from USB. If your flight controller, some do and some don't, if your flight controller doesn't power the receiver from USB, you'll need to plug a LiPo in to your quadcopter. Make sure your props are off and all that good stuff, but you need the receiver powered up and the flight controller plugged in. Then we're going to go into ExpressLRS Configurator. We're going to pick the target for our receiver, and in this case it's FrSky RX, R9mm, R9 Mini via Betaflight pass-through. And then we're going to go and we're going to make sure that all these options are the same. And this is important. For example, I already did this once, and when I flashed my module, I had the hybrid switches 8 option enabled. But when I flashed the receiver, I didn't. And as a result, it didn't bind and it just didn't work. So basically, you want the same options set for your receiver as you did when you flashed your module. And I believe I had hybrid switches 8 enabled. Do we want that enabled? I don't know. It was just enabled by default when I flashed the module, so we'll just leave that alone for now. ARM channel I had enabled. Some people in the ExpressLRS Discord said, you don't actually have to do that. We're just here to get it flashed, folks. We'll do the deep dive another day, maybe. Regulatory domain is the same, and my binding phrase is the same. Once that is all done, I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to hit build and flash. And what you're going to see is automatically the configurator is going to put the flight controller into pass-through mode, and it's going to flash. You're going to start seeing this light flash. See how it's blinking rapidly? It's flashed the receiver, and success. Done. There's only one thing left to do, and that's start up Betaflight Configurator and see if we have movement in the receiver tab. Yes, we have movement in the receiver tab. We did it. We're running ExpressLRS. All right, there are a couple gotchas here. You're going to want to check failsafe. Make sure failsafe works correctly. Always do that anytime you're working with it, especially if you're working with an unfamiliar receiver protocol. Hook it up to your quad, take your props off, arm your quad, and then turn the radio off, or in this case, we could also just pull the module out. The motors must stop when you do that. Otherwise, failsafe is not working right, and you need to figure out what's going on there. The other thing you're going to need to do is set up your aux modes. There's a catch here in ExpressLRS. ExpressLRS wants to know what your arming channel is, because ExpressLRS doesn't send every aux channel in every packet. Because like, how do you need to send the aux channels 200 times a second? Like, how fast can you really flip that switch? So in order to make the most efficient use of its airtime, it doesn't send the aux channels in every packet. But the arming channel, it wants to make sure that if you try to disarm, it disarms as quickly as possible. So you can see here when we flashed, we set the arming channel as aux1. You're going to want to make sure that you have your arming mode on aux1 in Betaflight. Hey there folks, Joshua from the future here. Actually, this is going away. The ability to tell ExpressLRS which aux channel you prefer to use for arming is going to go away for technical reasons that result in increased functionality overall. But the takeaway is that you must use aux1 channel 5 for your arm switch. You have to do that. If you don't, then your arming channel will not be sent in every packet, and it can result in a situation where, number one, your quad can just disarm spontaneously, or number two, you can try to disarm and the quad will not disarm because it hasn't gotten the message yet. You must use channel 5 aux1 as your arming channel. And this option that we're looking at right here, basically it's going to go away and you should just pretend it doesn't exist. And by the way, speaking of range, one more little tip. Here in the ExpressLRS Lua script, notice that my output power is only 10 milliwatts. Yeah, you could go pretty far on 10 milliwatts, but I don't know about you. I'm going to crank that sucker up to 250 milliwatts. Don't go above 250. In fact, I don't think it will. The module will overheat if you go above 250. I don't actually think you have to actually enable a special option to go above 250. So I'm not even sure it'll do it, but let's set this at, let's say 100 milliwatts.
Telemetry lost.
Give it a second. Yeah, we'll get some crazy range now, guys. That's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much to the beautiful folks over on the ExpressLRS Discord server who helped me out with a couple of little problems that I ran into along the way. And thank you to Alessandro, certainly one of, if not the main ExpressLRS dev who personally handheld me through several of the steps here. I'm really excited to get out and give this a fly and see how it works, how it feels. At the very least, it's not going to feel any worse than Crossfire or Tracer. 200 hertz updates, 250 hertz updates, isn't it? Why can't I have 250 hertz updates? I don't know. We'll put that in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Links to all the stuff down in the video description. Happy flying. You guys, I don't know where I am, and I don't know what's going to happen, but if I don't make it out of this, I just want to know that you subscribe to my channel, or maybe join my Patreon, or click one of these videos I picked out for you.